So for me, microaggressions are little comments that people make,
whether or not intentional or unintentional.
It's like talking about like stereotypes or like
racist or any kind of like
small words that everyone uses, you think are a cultural norm, that you think don't mean anything, but
it's like an indirect aggression.
An assumption about you, like a stereotype, that has to do with like race.
Wait, I'm trying to think of if I could define what a microaggression is, like in words.
So microaggressions are comments or reactions or actions or questions that get asked that communicate otherness or a sense of marginalization to people who have oppressed identities, right? So you can be microaggressed as a woman based on your gender, you can be microaggressed based on your race if you're a person of color, right? So it has to do with a larger system of power and privilege. And the difference between microaggressions and prejudice, which people often get confused, is that prejudice is sometimes embedded in microaggressions, right? So we may not be actively prejudiced against someone, but because so often microaggressions are rooted in stereotypes, that relates back to prejudice.
It originally came out in the 1970s by Dr. Chester Pierce, and he's a medical doctor and a psychiatrist. And so he termed, it wasn't actually termed microaggressions until he termed it in the 1970s, because he wanted to understand what was the impact that subtle and automatic negative statements, both verbal and nonverbal, against African Americans or the Black community, what effect does it have on that community? And then later on, Dr. Wing Su expanded the definition to talk about other marginalized communities, whether that's a religious minority, someone from the LGBTQ plus community, women and other marginalized communities, individuals with disabilities, etc.
It's not always what you're saying, it's how you're saying it, right? So there's a tangible difference between me asking someone, oh, where did you grow up? Or, yeah, tell me a little bit more about your background, than asking someone, what are you? And then when someone answers, pushing back and saying, no, where are you really from, right? If you just left it at the first question, that may be something that's seen as harmless, but challenging someone's answer once they said, I'm from New York, and then pushing that to get another answer can continue to make someone feel invalidated.
Met this girl and she asked what my ethnic background was, and I said I was Asian.
People would be like, what are you? Which is kind of like negative, honestly. It's like not a very good way to ask that.
People also ask me, where are you from? And typically I would say I'm from New York. And then they'll probe on and say, oh, where are your parents from? And they're also born here and they went to college, and I would also say they're from New York.
I look very Asian when I go to Brazil. And they assume I'm Chinese.
I'm Brazilian. And they're like, oh, I thought you were white. Or what kind of white are you? Or I've had people tell me that I'm actually not Brazilian.
To just clarify, she asked me again, like where, like to specify where I was from, and I said, ethnically I'm Vietnamese. And she said, I thought you said you're Asian.
And they assume everyone from Asia is Chinese.
And I'm like, did you give birth to me? Are you somehow in my family? How are you going to tell me that I'm not Brazilian?
They call me Chinese, which means Chinese. And they say random stuff like Abakashi, Pokemon, Pikachu, which is like stuff associated with Asian culture.
And then I'll have to go on and say, you know, yes, I am Chinese.
And I said, yes, Vietnam is a part of Asia. She replied with, I thought China was the only Asian country.
Just because I'm white, it does not mean that I'm not who I am. I'm Latina, I am Brazilian, and no one can take that away from me.
Especially as a first-year student, the impact can be really staggering, and that doesn't change with time, but I think when you're entering into college and people for the first time are placing a racial identity on you that you maybe didn't previously identify as the most important part of who you are. You don't see a lot of people that look like you, and you're constantly told like you are an other.
Microaggressions are experienced over time. Like if you can imagine, over time, like I can't tell you how many times I've walked into the store and gotten followed. I can't tell you how many times someone said, wow, you don't look like a lawyer, or you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Or I remember when I was applying for schools and I had a 3.8 GPA, I was in 2 varsity sports, was in 6 academic clubs, and I worked a job, and I applied to 3 schools, and the college counselor is saying, why don't you try to apply to a school that I think you can get into? I think you can get into a community college. That's the experiences, and when you experience them over time, it's the impact that it has, not just on your own sense of being, but it can affect individuals' decisions for your life.
People are consistently talking about affirmative action in conjunction with a conversation about students of color, or making an assumption that as a woman you must dress a certain way, or that you must be from a certain place if you look a certain way. So often, for example, like Asian American students, I hear are like people just assume that if you're Asian, you're from China, and not all Asians are from China. And so there's just a lot of stereotypes embedded in assumptions people make.
Guy in my art class, he came up to me and he asked me what my ethnicity was. So I told him that I was Cambodian.
When people find out that I'm either Moroccan or Arab, that they're always assuming that I belly dance.
And he said, oh, so do you eat spiders?
But actually I cannot physically dance. I'm horrible.
And I was like, no, what the hell? Who eats spiders? I mean, probably somebody does, but I don't.
It's important to remember intersectionality when you're thinking about microaggressions. So no one is ever just one identity, right? We all have a racial identity, we all have a gender, a sexual orientation, maybe religious views for some folks, we all have an age, right? And so as much as a certain identity may not be prevalent or salient to someone in that moment, that identity is still a part of who they are. And most things that are considered microaggressions to someone who doesn't understand the history might seem innocuous or harmless, right? So typically saying, oh, you speak English really eloquently wouldn't necessarily be seen as offensive. However, when you say that to someone as if you're surprised, right, and that person happens to be a person of color or happens to be someone who's not from the US, there's an assumption based in that statement that's almost like you're surprised that that person speaks English so well.
When individuals say that why don't you just get over microaggressions, or it's just a joke, or why are you taking it so seriously? I actually have a quote. It came from Dr. Salazano's work. So it says, perpetrators of racial microaggressions often unconsciously engage in the microaggressive act. So mostly people aren't trying, it's not usually intentional, right? And thus can commit the act with little thought or attention paid to the interaction. This unconscious intent of the perpetrator, the person making that comment, it makes confronting microaggressions difficult for marginalized communities, and is in one way that racism and other forms of oppression can perpetuate while being rendered invisible.
People often underestimate microaggressions, and there's nothing micro about feeling invalidated or othered, or like who you are is a part of a community, right? So the word micro as part of that term is kind of almost a misnomer, and to understand that there's a difference between intent and impact. So students will often say things like, oh, well, I didn't mean to be offensive, and it's great that that wasn't someone's intention, but it doesn't change the impact that it has on someone. So I like to give the example of if I'm driving a car and I sneeze while you're crossing the street and I accidentally hit you, I may not have meant to hurt you. It was a complete accident. It wasn't something I intended, and I could be the nicest person in the world, but that doesn't change the impact, because you still might have a broken leg regardless of what I meant to do or not do.
I have had students come up to me to talk about how they've been microaggressed, not just outside of the classroom with other students, but also in the classroom, where faculty members have made statements that target different students just based on their status.
People ask questions like, can a white person be microaggressed? And the answer is, well, not on the basis of race, but a white woman could be microaggressed based on her gender, or if she identifies as a lesbian, or if she is Muslim, right? And so those other identities are still a factor in her everyday experience.
Even based on my identity, my intersected identity, sometimes I'm in the more dominant group and sometimes in the more oppressed group. And I'll give you an example, like based on my race, I can be an oppressed group, or my gender, I can oppressed group, but based on my status at the university or my socioeconomic status, I can be in a more dominant group. So it could just depend based on your status.
My professor approaches me and like we started talking. She asked me if this was my real hair.
I remember one time when I just got to the US and somebody had asked me why I spoke good English.
People assume that I'm Jewish because of my nose and my hair.
As a Dominican, I would sometimes be asked if I eat plátanos every day.
I would get random people or my friends coming up to me and like, oh, can you help me with this math problem?
I'm like, yeah, of course it is. She's like, are you sure? It's like too long and too healthy. I'm like, yeah, sure. For example, there was once for one of the Jewish holidays, they were having special dinners that you could sign up for, and I was walking with a group of my friends, and the guy that was tabling only asked me if I wanted to sign up and didn't ask any of my friends.
Even if I was from Nigeria, and I was like, yeah, I speak English because they speak English in Nigeria.
And then also people would ask me if my father owned a barbershop in New York.
And I'm like, I'm not that good at math. I can try, but then they were like, oh, I thought you're Asian.
But I'm not actually Jewish, I'm actually Armenian. And then she like touches it and pulls it a little, and she was just surprised that it's not an extension.
Yeah, so I'm the main resource for that, one of the main, as the Chief Officer of Diversity and Inclusion. Any student, faculty, or staff can come to me to talk about what they're experiencing. That's more if they want to sort of discuss what I would say more of an informal resolution. Other forms that are more formal is a student can fill out a bias incident response form. That's where if you feel like there's a bias related incident or there's a hate incident or a hate crimes to me need to go directly to our campus police department because that's an imminent threat to your safety. But if it's not an imminent threat to your safety, you can fill out a bias incident response program, and there's several senior administrators that serve on that team, and we would respond that incident based on the facts, and we would see if there's a violation of a policy like the student code of conduct or any other laws or policy, if there's a remedial or disciplinary action that takes place. But a lot of it is more proactive engagement, educational awareness, and bringing the parties together.
So my office is definitely available. I work in the Office of Multicultural and First Generation Student Support, and we often just have conversations with students to help them navigate through certain experiences that they've had, because sometimes you may second guess whether you should say something. You can be microaggressed by people that you love. So what happens when your best friend microaggresses you, or even a parent microaggresses you, or what happens when there's a power dynamic and your faculty member says something in the classroom that feels wrong to you or feels offensive? How do you address those situations? And there are a lot of allies both within our office but also within other offices on campus, like the Dean of Students, Student Leadership and Programming. There are a lot of faculty members that really understand the impact of microaggressions and want to support students through those experiences. There's also a website called the Microaggressions Project, and I believe it's www.microaggressions.com, and people can submit different microaggressions that they've experienced. So I would highly recommend, if someone's unclear about microaggressions or not sure what they actually sound like and the impact they have, that you check out that project. I also worked with students at Northeastern who, based on learning about microaggressions, wanted to spread awareness throughout the campus. So they created a campaign. It's now on Facebook. You can search for it. It's called Don't Put Me in a Box. And they did a photo campaign and had students pose with boxes that said different microaggressions that they had experienced. So it was a nice way for people to kind of reclaim ownership over what had been said about them and change the narrative. I think the first way of tackling the issue is to create a sense of urgency, because right now there's a lot of debate going around about whether it's important to teach about microaggressions, whether we're teaching people to be too sensitive, but I think that's a very privileged standpoint to have, because often the times that the people who are making those kinds of statements haven't gone through their lives being microaggressed or invalidated based on an identity that they hold.
But also the way that mainstream media covers diversity events in general is, whenever you talk about diversity, the immediate counter argument is you're coddling students, you're not preparing them for the real world, you're impinging on academic freedom or freedom of speech. Those are generally the counter narratives to talking about diversity and inclusion. So I don't think it was just microaggressions. I could have talked about anything about diversity and inclusion. I think based on the trend of mainstream media, that's been the result. And it makes it seem like this work is reductive, and they reduce it to a laundry list as you're telling people, do this, don't do that. That has nothing to do with diversity work. Diversity work is all about bringing in awareness to have both institutional as well as individual changes. And my argument, as I'm an attorney as well, I absolutely believe in freedom of speech, and one form of speech is talking about diversity-related issues.